Hi, and welcome to the Friendly City Books podcast. I have Dr. Grace Elizabeth Hale with me today. I'm Hillary Richardson. Dr. Hale is the Commonwealth Professor of American Studies and History at the University of Virginia. She's an award-winning historian and internationally recognized expert on modern American culture and the regional culture of the U.S. South. She's the author of 3 previous books, including Making Whiteness, The Culture of Segregation in the South, 1890 to 1940, and she lives in Charlottesville, Virginia. We're going to be talking about her new book, In the Pines. It is In the Pines, a lynching, a lie, and a reckoning, and it's a story of obsession, injustice, and the ties that bind. In the Pines casts an unsparing eye over this intimate terrain, driven by a deep desire to set straight the historical record and to understand and subvert white racism, along with its structures, costs, and consequences, and the lies that sustain it. Dr. Hale is coming to Columbus, Mississippi on Saturday, February 24th at 2 p.m. At the Columbus Arts Council. This event is sponsored by Friendly City Books, the MSU History Department, and the Arts Council. And they are sponsoring a conversation between Grace. May I call you Grace?
Absolutely.
Wonderful. Thank you. Grace and our own Mississippi's Ralph Eubanks. And her book will be available for purchase there. I just finished this book and I'm excited to talk about it. So let me just start by asking you the research journey that you went on to write this book seems like it must have taken you through some really interesting twists and turns. And I wonder, how does somebody go from debunking a family folktale, filling in gaps in the record that just don't exist, and, embarking on this journey? For someone who's like maybe not a historian, could you tell us like the highlight reel of some of your hills and valleys in that journey?
Well, definitely the highlight reel, because the truth of historical research is that sometimes it's very boring and tedious, and it's looking for, a needle in a haystack. And the nature of it is really persistence. I mean,
Yeah.
that's, if you want to research anything, you just have to stay at it, right?
Mm-hmm.
But to give you the highlight reels, I sort of tried a two-pronged approach to researching this book. I think it's common to really all historians who work on the more recent past, or at least the 20th century. And that is that I was looking for any possible kind of documentation I could find, while also at the same time talking to people. 1947 is a long time ago, and that's when the main event that this book talks about happens. But it's not so long ago that people aren't alive, or people are alive whose older relatives told them about something. And so I tried both of those approaches, what scholars would call an oral history approach, which really means a kind of systematic method of interviewing and also looking for all kinds of documents. One thing that really helps on that front is the digitization of so many genealogical records. And so lots of listeners who might not be historians themselves, but might have done their own sort of research into their own family history, will understand those methods. And those digitized records are really a godsend for that kind of work. And I don't really, frankly, know how I could have written this book before those records were digitized. And really a highlight of that research was finding Versi Johnson, who's one of the main characters of the book, finding his family, traces of his family in census and military records. And there were definitely ups and downs to that search. One of the things that is really, I think, would be surprising to many listeners is that the way people spell their names is not very standardized in the past. And also the people who are recording their names for government documents don't necessarily ask people how to spell their names. And people have different degrees of literacy, so they might not have an understanding of how to spell their names. And so that can be really quite the journey there. So Versi Johnson, who is a Black man, really at the center of this story, his name is spelled Versey Johnson, Vergus Johnson, Bursey Johnson. I mean, and I could go on. And so,
Wow.
that's when I found the family in the 1930 census, it was only because Versey has a sister named Gertrude, and that's an unusual enough name. And I had a certain idea of where they lived to find them. Johnson's a very common name for Black people in Mississippi. So that was hard. But thank you, Sister Gertrude. That was unusual enough that I located him. And the reason that I couldn't find him with his name is because his name was spelled Bursey with a B. So
I found some similar problems. So I'm a librarian, and a lot of those digitizations scan documents and they pull typewritten, they do like a document recognition. And so the thing that's on the document may not be the thing that is on the computer because the computer didn't recognize the R, thought it was an N or something. So yeah.
Yeah. So I think that's, listeners might be interested in this, but in those genealogical records, the name can be misspelled because the person doesn't know how to spell their own name, because the person filling out the document spells it wrong, or because the person transcribing the document, if that's a person or if it's machine read, can't make out the handwriting. So all of those ways to introduce errors, right? Mm-hmm. So that was a real highlight of the research, was just those moments when I was able to find Versey Johnson in the records. It's really hard to find records for Black Americans before 1870, the 1870 census. Before that, if people are enslaved, they're not counted. They're counted in the census, but they're not enumerated by name. And so any kind of trace of his family members I could find, that was a victory. I found a great-great-grandparents help, and the people that enslaved them in Mississippi. And that was a real highlight too. On the oral history side, it was finding someone who was alive in 1947 and remembered what had happened. And that took a lot of digging, and it was just, you just have to talk to everybody you can and then hope that somebody, something turns up. And I got really lucky, in part because of Ralph Eubanks. And so since Ralph is going to be with me at Friendly City Books, I should say that Ralph actually introduced me to the person that introduced me to the person who actually was alive, lived most of his life in Jeff Davis County, and remembered what had happened.
Wow. It's a small town, this state of Mississippi.
Yes, indeed.
Wow. Well, another thing that I wanted you to talk about, or I'm hoping you to talk about, is how you kind of combined all of these historical records, all of the documentation and fact finding with your memories and kind of a memoir of maybe not just yourself, although I think that's part of it, but your family members. So can you say what it was like to divulge such a personal story that might feel, I don't know, you might have some feelings about that story with writing this historical record and giving a man a history whose history was so, I don't know, non-existent is not the right word, but hard to find.
Yeah. That was a real challenge. And so I early on adopted a strategy of trying to treat my own memories and my family's memories just like I treated everyone else's. I mean, I've done a lot of work in the past and projects I've worked on with oral history. So I'm used to talking to people, recording their memories of the past, and thinking about what people's memories can tell us about the past and where they might need to be sort of checked against other records. I mean, all of us have really, really bad memories, to be completely honest. There's some people's memories are better than others, but people are generally pretty bad, for example, at remembering their life in a kind of chronological way. Nerdy historians, otherwise, not everybody thinks about life in a chronology. And so what you get when you talk to people, you get kind of sort of, when something has a kind of intense impression or a very emotional sort of situation, people will remember it and they can tell you how they felt, and they can give you a sense of what that experience was like. But sort of to place that in an exact moment in time and to think about it in the way that historians think about the past, you need to bring in other documents as well. And those documents leave out the sort of personal details or details about how something felt that people can provide. And, every kind of evidence has its sort of strengths and weaknesses. And so I was very accustomed to using sources in that way, if that makes sense, understanding like what the strengths and weaknesses are of different kinds of sources and how you need to put them in conversation with each other to really get a full picture of the past. And I tried to the best of my ability to apply that to my own family memories as well. In other words, I wanted to check them against the documents that exist, and not just the digital documents that exist, but the documents that exist in local records. One of the hardest places to do research in America are courthouse records, which are kept in different states in different ways. In Mississippi, they're mostly in the Chancery Clerk's offices, and those kinds of records are pretty hard to research in, but nevertheless very necessary. And so I subjected my own sort of family's memories and to the degree that it was possible, my own, to sort of being held against those other sources.
Yeah, I'm imagining that was difficult, not just because, they're your memories, but also because what you're talking about seems like a difficult subject matter to pin on yourself or to be a part of. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, it is difficult, but I kept in mind what I sort of knew from my past work is that oral history is really great for telling you about how something felt, and that is something to know about the past, if that makes sense. Like how it felt to experience something is important to know about the past. And so I was able to say how I felt about something without sort of thinking of that feeling as the most important aspect of something about the past, or as the truth of it, if that makes sense. It was the truth of my own experience, and I could talk about how I felt about my grandfather, for example, while also I was very much trying also at the same time to say that's clearly not all of his personhood.
Yeah.
He was, as almost everyone is, a complicated person with many facets. I was his granddaughter. I did not know all those parts of him. And so I tried to present him in that way.
Yeah, and I think you did. I liked the end of I think maybe it was the epilogue where you said, like, he took me fishing and we rode horses. And I think that people will have a lot of those memories about their grandparents, but recognizing that, like you said, they're complicated and they might have made decisions that, either they regret or we have to face is part of it. But I really enjoyed that section. I also enjoyed, I can't remember exactly the words that you said, but you were speaking just now of noticing the strengths and weaknesses of sources. And I think it might have been about newspapers where you said something like the papers reported this event in this way, but I knew, and my ears and my eyes have been trained that didn't happen that way. Can you say like more about, I don't know, certain dog whistles that you picked up on, or how you knew that something wasn't the way that it was reported?
Yeah, well, this is one of the reasons why I think the current history wars in America are so interesting, because people have a way of sort of reading documents from the past without a deep enough understanding of their context to make sense of them. And we understand things in our own present through all kinds of contextual clues that we're not necessarily thinking about. And when those clues are missing in the past, people can interpret materials incorrectly. And so, I had been to grad school. I was in grad school, in fact, the first time I tried to look up documentation, newspaper documentation of this event where my grandfather was supposed to have been a hero and kept a mob from taking a man from his jail. And I was in grad school, and I must say, probably just a tiny bit full of myself, as grad students can be, if you have any experience. If
you know.
And I'd learned how to do research, right? And I'd read Ida B. Wells, and I'd read W.E.B. Du Bois, and I'd looked at all the NAACP, records about their anti-lynching campaign. And so I, armed with all that knowledge, I set off for the local Prentice Headlight newspaper office. And lucky for me, it's a monthly paper, or I might still be there reading it. It wasn't a daily paper, not a huge long paper either, because I didn't even have the date when this incident had supposedly happened. But I kind of had a vague sense. I knew it was in his first term, so I guess I had a 4-year period to look through. And then when I found this newspaper article about the incident on the front page, really the key thing for me, there were other things, but I think the key thing was that the newspaper insisted that Versie Johnson had asked to be taken out of the jail so that
almost
he could
too much.
Yes, that he had asked to be taken back to the site of the alleged rape so that he could explain what happened. And it's absolutely obvious if you give it much thought, but no Black man in 1947 is going to ask to be taken out of a small rural place's jail and into the countryside. In its prime lynching territory. I mean, no one's going to ask that. And that, to me, was the strongest sign. There were others, but that clue just jumped off the page, right? Mississippi built what was billed across the country as the nation's most mob-proof jail for a reason. In Jackson, they built the jail on top of the courthouse. I believe it was 6 floors up. I might have that wrong. It might be 5 floors up, but they built during the Depression. They got WPA funds and built the county building there in Jackson, and they put a jail on top of it for a reason.
So prisoners would stay in there.
Exactly. And so Mississippi sheriffs had the option of sending their prisoners to the jail in Jackson, where really it was pretty impossible to take anybody out of that facility. And sometimes they chose to do that and sometimes they didn't. But the fact that it exists gives you a sense of the prevalence of these kinds of activities in Mississippi, which had, as most people probably know, has the largest number of documented lynchings. All lynching statistics are most likely an undercount in this country, but as far as the counts that we have, and they're always expanding, Mississippi is the leading lynching state. So that really stuck out to me as really undermining the whole sort of account in the newspaper, if you will.
Yeah, that was really interesting to hear, because I've heard many people who are doing research with Mississippi newspapers like the Clarion Ledger call it things. I think, people who are doing this research know that you can't rely. The text is not the, end all be all. You cannot rely on some of these newspaper reports because they were funded by, I don't know, groups that didn't want the truth to come out, or, in the Clarion Ledger now, I don't believe would be the way that it was in the 40s and the 50s. So not to call them out or anything, but I think it's really interesting.
I will also say the Prentice Headlight still exists, but has, different editors, different owners. And I also don't think it would do that now. So I'd like to just say that. But I think we have this way of thinking that that our era has this kind of partisanship and kind of crazy sort of disregarding of the truth that is like unprecedented in history and unparalleled. And I think again, I think that just shows that most Americans don't know much about history because really starting in the late 1930s, lynching was so politicized by the anti-lynching fight and the attempt in Congress every year to pass anti-lynching legislation. Some years as many as 50 or 60 anti-lynching bills would be introduced in the US Congress. And it really was a kind of politicizing partisan issue across the country. And that really shaped reporting about lynching all the way down to like the local, state and local newspaper level.
Wow. Yeah. It seems like that wouldn't be a partisan issue, but here we are.
It really becomes one because the anti-lynching activists use any kind of news about lynching as sort of fuel for their fight. And so what really changes in the rural South, and especially Mississippi, but other parts of the rural Deep South, is that what people would have bragged about probably a few years before, by the 1940s, they're trying to cover it up.
Yeah. Yeah. You talked about several stories that had parallels to your own, speaking of other, incidents. And I'd like to hear more about how you decided to weave those stories like Duck Hill, and there were a couple of other towns, weave those stories in with the Prentice story of that your book is about.
Well, always, as I said, understanding history means you have to understand some context. And so I do think when you're trying to write history for the public, there's two things sort of at war with each other. One is on the one hand, you want to have kind of narrative drive. You want to have a story that holds readers' attention and that moves along a kind of arc of discovery. But on the other hand, you want to provide the kind of necessary knowledge to understand what's going on, that kind of needed historical context. And I think most of us historians, and I think I can say this after 25 years in the field, we tend to provide too much information. We're obsessed with context and we want to get it all in there, right? And so that really was a challenge. I appreciate the question, Hillary, because it was a real challenge to try to sort of strip away everything that wasn't necessary, but yet provide context that a reader that doesn't come with a lot of knowledge would be able to understand. For example, the way that lynching gets politicized by the 1940s and how that shapes the events in the story. And so I picked other events, other sort of incidents to talk about based on my sense. And, I don't know that I got this exactly right, but is this something that people need to know about? Absolutely have to know about to understand this story. And one of those acts of violence was one that occurred in Jeff Davis County right after the county was formed. And so that seemed to me like it needed to go in there because it's the only recorded lynching for Jeff Davis County that's officially recorded in statistics like at the Equal Justice Initiative. When you go to the lynching anti-lynching memorial there's one name on the bar for Jeff Davis County. The Duck Hill lynching doesn't happen in Jeff Davis County, but it is really the sort of act that drives this kind of massive politicization because Congress is debating anti-lynching legislation as that lynching is happening, and somebody telegraphs members of Congress and they actually are able to talk about that lynching. I think it's the day after, but maybe even the afternoon that it happened, like in Congress. And that actually propels the passage in the House of Representatives of an anti-lynching bill. I think it's maybe the second time that's ever happened. It fails in the Senate because of a filibuster, just to make us again think about how much some things keep coming up in our history. But it is really the event, or I wanted to use that event as a way to talk about how the practice of racial violence changes as it becomes politicized and as people start to try to cover it up at the kind of local and state level. It in the past, the newspapers in the South really openly talk about lynchings that happen, and people will go on record and almost brag about it who participate. And by the by the late 30s, early 40s, that's really changed. And Duck Hill sort of is a way for me to talk about how that change happens.
And I think you did a really good job of strengthen numbers with the violence that had been going on. It didn't stop. It just was talked about differently, or was, spread through word of mouth instead of the newspaper. And so I think it's an important thing, at least in my opinion, for us to realize that, this was not the end of a violent time. It was just a shift, I guess.
Yeah, I think the NAACP put it well when they said lynching has gone underground. So yes, there is some decrease in numbers, but also there is just a real shift in how that kind of use of violence to police Black people happens.
Yeah. I want to switch up my question because I really enjoyed the running theme, I guess, of talking about the land that you did in the Pines. I guess your title is evocative of the land. But from the beginning of the county, when people settled it, you write about how they inhabit the land and their relationship with the land. And even before that, the people who lived there, their relationship with the land, and how they named things and how they used the resources that the land provided. And how you, I guess, or how people even abused those resources, and how that has left a mark on that county and maybe beyond. So I'd love to hear your wisdom about the relationships between Southerners and their rural homes, like Prentice. And I wonder if there's a difference in the way that white farmers and Black farmers, or white rural Southerners and Black rural Southerners, interacted with the land. And yeah, I'll stop there.
Well, I was trying to evoke Mississippi for people that are not necessarily from Mississippi. I mean, I hope to have readers who have longtime roots in Mississippi, but imagining the nation of readers, I knew there would be people whose thoughts about Mississippi would really probably be kind of a stereotype that was not particularly accurate and was based more on the Mississippi Delta than other parts of the state. And most people have never heard of the Piney Woods region of Mississippi or thought about it at all. I mean, actually, there's a kind of Piney Woods sort of area across multiple states, but it's not sort of a region that has not a sort of landscape, I think, that we today have a lot of knowledge of. And I really wanted to shake people out of that like stereotype of the Delta. And then I thought for people that do have roots in Mississippi, they would just really enjoy a story that actually really tries to pay attention to the particularities of the place and figures the place as a kind of character in the story. So I thought that that would be appealing to readers with and without knowledge, if that makes sense, of the place. But the main reason was to get people out of a sense that Mississippi is the Mississippi Delta. And talking about the land gave me a way to talk about how people had settled it and why they were so attached to the land. And that was something that I felt very much talking to people in Jeff Davis County, because so many of the people that I talked to were there because the family owned land there and they had either gone away and worked other places and then retired back to family land, or they had perhaps commuted to work a pretty long drive away, but had stayed in Jeff Davis County for that land. And because the economy is really, really bad there, at least in terms of the people I talked to, that was a very common experience, beyond retirees, and actually very much including retirees. Many Black people I talked to had, for example, been away to work all over the country and then moved back to retire because the family owned land. And so that just seemed for white and Black people to be such a powerful part of why people are there and have been there and how they've lived there. And I think, again, many Americans who are either don't have rural roots or are far removed from them don't have an understanding of that. And I felt like that was something this book could do, besides its particular story, is just try to give readers who may not have that sense of deep connection to place, like a sense of why that's so important to people. I mean, the other part of your question, whether Black and white people have a different way of interacting with the land or living on the land, I think people differ, but I don't think the divisions divide up neatly according to racial difference, at least for the Jeff Davis County landscape. And another reason I really wanted to go into how people lived on the land is I was trying to evoke, I think one of the most important things, at least in terms of my thinking, that I was trying to do in this book is to give people, again, without roots in the area, people with roots in the area know this, but that this was a place of real Black flourishing. And I say that without in any way trying to diminish the oppressions of Jim Crow segregation. That has been one of the major topics of research for me across my career. So I think I have a pretty good understanding of it. And I'm not at all trying to diminish that when I say that, but I think that both white and Black Americans today need to know about Black flourishing, that we don't need to just know about acts of violence and Black death. We need to know about Black life. And certainly, again, people with roots in this area and family members that are from here know that story, but it's not a broadly known story that many people in some parts of Mississippi, many Black people owned their own land. And especially outside the Delta. And again, I think this way that people outside Mississippi are kind of like obsessively interested in the Delta makes them not know this story. But in Jeff Davis County, many Black people moved there after emancipation to get away from the Delta. It's not that far from the Delta, but far enough away. It also is inexpensive. The land was really inexpensive there, comparatively speaking. It's not nearly as rich is one of the reasons. It was also covered by longleaf pine forests, many parts of it into the 1930s. So the land was affordable. And many people moved there. They were able to buy land. A few people even homesteaded land and have their own farms there and have, the kind of security of having their own land, their own community, their own farms. And some of those farmers by the first decades of the 20th century own 1,000 acres, some of those Black farmers. And there's over 300 Black owned farms in the latter part of the Depression in Jeff Davis County. Probably that's a decline. It's the Depression. People are losing their land. So I don't have a statistic from right before, but I would imagine that's a decline. But when you look at farm households, Black farm households in Jeff Davis County, about a third of the families own their own land. And that's an incredible story that I don't think most people know. And those farmers, they found their own private school, which grows into a college, the Prentice Institute, that really develops into a kind of institution that sort of serves whatever the educational needs are of the community. At various points in its history, it's educating toddlers to grandparents. It's running an elementary school, a high school, a junior college, and a teacher training school. For a while, it has seminary classes. It runs vo-tech school. Then it's a junior college. It just sort of serves whatever needs there are in the community. And that institution creates a real, educated group of folks who, a lot of white people don't have any education. And yet here we have, Black people getting 2 years of college, for example. This community story, because there has been such kind of economic decline there now, not really that many people there that are left there to tell that story.
Mm.
I think it's not, obviously, again, it's not lost for the people whose heritage that is, but for the larger sort of national sort of understanding, that story isn't being told.
Yeah. And it's such a wonderful story because you would think, you know, oh, I grew up here, I should know things like that. But you're right. The regardless of race, the pride that people have in their sense of place, and the agency that they have, it's not just a status symbol, but it's like you said, a place where you can be, grow, where you can raise a family, all of that wonderful stuff, and build a community, was, I thought, a really like undersung but very magical part of the story that, just owning your own piece of land can be a magical thing, I guess.
Yeah, I think that it is for, there is a kind of myth in American history of the small farmer. There's a kind of romanticization of that.
Mm.
But the reason that that is so powerful, I think, is because there is some truth in it. There is some truth in being able to have, the means to sort of grow your own food and to work, not working for a boss that can treat you badly, that can harm you, that you're able to have that kind of separation, that kind of independence, that that is very appealing to many, many white people who settle in the piney woods, but it's equally, and perhaps more, let me just say, more appealing to Black people. Think about the aftermath of emancipation. It is even more appealing to them. They want separation from white people who've enslaved them. They want their family to be safe. They want their family to be fed. They want that independence of white people. And for a while, they, to some degree, achieve that in Jeff Davis County.
Yeah. I didn't want that to go without recognition because I just thought it was so powerful.
Yeah. I mean, if anybody is in that part of the woods, the most interesting thing to see is the Rosenwald School at the former Prentice Institute. I mean, much
so the
of
building
the
is still
campus,
there.
yeah, much of the campus is in ruins, and that's really, really tragic that the state of Mississippi did not find some other use for this. What was once a many buildings, a big campus that could have been put to many uses, but now much of it's in ruins. But through the work of alums, former employees and alums, they got funding to restore the Rosenwald building there, which is a really large, rare kind of Rosenwald building. Listeners might not know Rosenwald buildings, but it's a fund established through Booker T. Washington's efforts with one of the founders of Sears and Roebuck. Rosenwald provides the money, and sort of Booker T. Washington really sort of help, and people at Tuskegee kind of get the program going and figure out how people are going to get the money. But communities sign up for these funds, and they agree to provide, like, people will work on it, and they'll provide, like, local people will provide lumber or provide supplies and labor. And then there's money coming from the Rosenwald Fund, and their plans that the Rosenwald people give you. And it's sort of a cooperative effort, if that makes sense, with that funding making the difference. And oftentimes, frankly, local and state governments will give a little bit of money, like Jeff Davis County put in a little bit of money there for the building of that building. But it was much cheaper than them building a Black school building, right? This was a much easier way to get a building for Black education they didn't have to pay for. So those buildings went up across the South, and most of them are very tiny. And a lot of them have been lost over the years, but there have been efforts to preserve them. And this is a really large, special kind of Rosenwald building. So it also has a small sort of museum to the Prentice Institute in it. And really, it's just a fascinating place to visit.
Yeah, there's a group I've worked with over the past few months, similar to this, in Oktibbeha County. And there's a small museum here as well. I don't think it's connected to Rosenwald, but the small African-American schools that popped up in these rural areas and then became like a really thriving community for these folks who, lived in the middle of nowhere, so to speak. And they had like a really thriving time, but now the building is closed, or I'm sorry, the school is closed, or the building is in disrepair. I've seen this a few times where the people who live there don't, like, they just put in their energy and their own time and their own money to just sustain it. And I kind of think that's really an example of what you can do with just being passionate about something. And I wonder how many of those exist, because certainly in Prentice, Oktibbeha, Lowndes County, we've seen those. I'm sure they're everywhere.
I mean, and I can name 2 Rosenwald buildings that are preserved here nearby where I live in rural Albemarle County through the efforts of a handful of community members that have the wherewithal to stay at it. And then at some point, somebody knows how to apply for a grant, and, they just muddle along and they save the building. And I do think that is a real, that is a very common story of historic preservation of spaces of Black history in rural places, especially urban too, but even more so in rural places, is that people, just local people, do it somehow. Do
you think it's because they have to, if they want it to happen, and there's not as much institutional help or systemic help? They just decide, if it's going to get done, I got to do it.
I do think that's it. I think in general, right now, we're not doing a good job with preservation of historic structures in rural America. It's exacerbated by racism, so certainly not denying that, but we don't really do a good job of preserving spaces of importance in the history of our rural places. In general in America, across lines of race and class, those places that have so much economic decline, and are facing a whole host of problems. This, historic preservation may not be first and foremost on their lists, but they're also not getting funding or help really from outside people. So I think it's a real problem, but I do think one of the things that you really do see huge evidence of Black communities stepping up in a way that maybe other communities don't as much. Maybe it's a kind of tradition. It's so common in Black communities to have local historians. Some usually it's a woman. It's an older woman who's just taken up the local history as a passion project and is saving it. And that saving can involve collecting the information and the stories, but also saving the buildings. And those people really are so important.
Yeah, totally. I have another question that is a little bit of a tangent, but there was something you wrote. I'm going to read, if it's okay, just so few sentences, that you were quoting from another historian, and it was so evocative and accessible to me that I was hoping you could talk more about it. But you have written, according to Bryant Simon, that, let's see, the central idea of this way of thinking, being a system of cheap, he calls it. This way of thinking about structuring society is that the combination of less pay, less regulation, and less attention to the economic and racial inequities of the past is the best way to solve the nation's most pressing problems. And he calls that cheap. And I just thought, wow, that's so poetic almost. Could you talk more about how that plays a part in the story that you wrote?
Well, Hillary, thanks for asking that, because it gives me a chance to plug Bryant Simon's really brilliant book, Hamlet Fire, which is a book about a fire at a very small chicken processing plant in the 1990s in Hamlet, North Carolina. And it sort of made the national news because a lot of workers died because some of the doors to the building were locked and people couldn't escape. But Bryant uses the story of that fire as a way to just really dig into and tell the story of in particular, this struggling North Carolina town, but really in many ways the story of rural Southern towns everywhere, not just that one, and their struggles, their economic decline, and what has happened to the people that live there across, especially the second half of the 20th century. So really urge readers to read it. It's beautifully written and it's super smart. And I love the way that he describes something that scholars more and more will use the term neoliberalism, but I think for the general public, that's a confusing word.
It doesn't make sense, but cheap does.
It's a confusing word because you have to know this whole complicated intellectual history, that, it's my job to know, right? So I know it, but it's not most people's job to know it. And it would take me an hour to give it a good explanation here. So I'm not going to, but, I think that this idea of a kind of regime of cheap gives us a way to understand it, that you don't have to know all of that sort of long history of the creation of classical liberalism in the post-Enlightenment period forward. You don't have to know all that to understand cheap. So Bryant's idea is that this kind of new way of thinking about the economy, about community, about society, is based around this sort of agreement about cheap. So if you think about sort of what preceded that as a vision, some people in academia will use the term Fordist, relating to the Ford Motors Company, to talk about a world where people, Ford famously paid his workers more because he figured out that if he paid them more, they could become his best customers. They would buy the cars. And so the idea that we're going to have a sort of set of agreements in society that workers will make their own sort of share of the profits, and then they will be able to consume the products, and that all of that is going to work together, that we have a regime of not cheap, but what would be the opposite of that? Enough resources, more, and when cheap replaces that, the vision is that we are going to reward people with cheap goods. That rather than like enough healthcare or a community that's secure and stable, or a job that pays enough to support a family, what we would now call a living wage, that those are the rewards of the old system. Under this new system, the rewards will be cheap goods. But of course, we've seen what that does to the world. It really puts so many local businesses out of business. It decimates rural America. I mean, if you're pursuing cheap, if you want to have the cheapest possible goods, the lowest cost for labor, and he calls it cheap government that doesn't regulate. I mean, he brings up the statistic that in North Carolina, because of federal regulations, they inspect the chicken to make sure the chicken in the plant is safe for people to eat, but they don't inspect the plant to see if it's a safe place for people to work, right? So in other words, the chicken is safe, but the workplace is dangerous, right? So cheap government means we're not spending what we need to spend on regulations, very low cost labor. So people are envisioned as cheap. We don't want to pay much to have them do jobs. And the reward for all that is cheap products, cheap goods, which are somehow supposed to be enough to, sustain us, to give us meaning in life. And I just don't think that has played out very well. If you look at the lack of, the empty, deserted towns, small towns all across America that used to be sustained by local businesses and by manufacturing, for example. Jeff Davis County, to bring it back to Jeff Davis County, they had for years a factory that produced wiring harnesses, I believe for Cadillac, but for one of the major car companies. And that provided a lot of jobs. They ran 3 shifts a day there. Hundreds of workers worked there. That was killed by NAFTA. right? So the North American Free Trade Agreement allowed the car companies to ship those kinds of jobs overseas, and for much, much cheaper labor. And I guess the reward is that you can buy a cheaper Cadillac. But if you can't buy a car, that's not much of a reward, right? If you don't have a job at all and you can't buy a car, or especially not a new car, that's not much of a reward. So you can see that playing out in Jeff Davis County. They never have been able to replace those jobs that were lost when that plant left. They keep trying to attract industry to Jeff Davis County. They've had a few things come in and hire a small number of people and then go out of business. So they've not for lack of trying, they have not been successful. And that is a story that is true across rural America. The North American Free Trade Agreement and then China's entry into the World Trade Organization was in the early 2000s is kind of the sort of icing on the cake of just really eliminating all of these industrial jobs that were in rural America. Again, I think a history people don't think about because they think, factories were in cities, but actually much industrial production was dispersed into rural areas, and now it's gone.
Would you say that the system of cheap, it adversely affects all of us, but that it more so affects these communities in rural areas, specifically the disenfranchised or, people who are working their way through poverty? I don't know. Would you say that they feel it harder?
I just think all of rural America has felt it. I think it has just decimated rural America. I don't blame people for wanting, for example, to buy their goods more cheaply. I'm motivated in the same ways myself, right? Yeah. So I remember when my grandparents, who always did all their shopping locally, started driving from Prentice to Hattiesburg, for example, because the grocery store was cheaper. Or, oh gosh, all of a sudden there's a Walmart there, right? And you can drive, you have to drive there, but it's less expensive. And, thrifty working class people are motivated by that. That's not something we shouldn't admire. So I, in no way do I want to sound like I'm blaming them, but that process of seeking out the cheapest goods and corporations as holding up their ability to produce goods the most cheaply as a great good for all of us has not turned out to be that way. And I think all people who live in rural America have suffered tremendously. And always in America, the poorest people suffer the most. So I guess that's a very long-winded way of saying, yes, you're right. Because if you're already low income and struggling, then anything that happens is going to hurt you much worse than someone above you. But it's killed rural towns, right?
Yeah. I have one more question. I noticed, so let me look at my question that I wrote out, that Brian Stevenson is on the front and the back of your book, giving it a blurb. And John Grisham, who writes the foreword, talks about his visit to Equal Justice Initiative, which Brian Stevenson, I guess, founded. Is that the right word? And what a great couple of people to be blurbing your book, first of all. But I wondered, with his blurb and with his description, and you also mentioned the EJI just a few minutes ago, I think. Can you talk about how that work with the museum, the monument, the legacy building, how that work maybe influenced your storytelling, if it's fair to say that it influenced it, or maybe it just took part, I don't know. But could you talk about that work and the story that you told?
Well, I think, many people know something of the story from Brian Stevenson's Just Mercy, and just the history of EJI, and maybe they visited the anti-lynching memorial or the Legacy Museum there. But what I think is really interesting, I wouldn't say that their work directly influenced me, because I began my work as a historian
You've been
studying
doing this.
lynching.
Mm-hmm.
So not to say for a second they're not hugely important, but just because in part, I mean, really in large part, my work on lynching originates from having grown up with my family story that I unpack and deconstruct in this book,
Yeah.
right? But I've been at it for a long time. But what I find really interesting about EJI is they're a law firm, right? They're a law firm, and people have now forgotten that because they are so much more than a law firm. But I say that not to diminish their efforts, but to say they started this work because they believed that the lack of understanding of history was one of the major things blocking their clients from having a fair trial.
Mm-hmm.
And so this idea that we could create a fair criminal justice system without having an understanding of this history, that came to them to see like there's no way to reform this system without coming to terms with and reckoning with this history. It can't just happen sort of in a vacuum. It has to happen in part by acknowledging sort of where we've been and how it's operated in the past and all of the kinds of obstacles and forms of oppression that their clients had faced before they began to represent them. And that needed to be part of the understanding of any judge, jury, anyone trying to create justice, right?
Yeah.
and mercy, to quote Brian Stevenson. So I think it's important, like that. I think is as important, and that is a really incredible endorsement of why history is important, right? I mean, I was already a historian.
You were there.
I didn't need to be, no, I just mean I didn't need to be convinced history was important, but most people do. Most people do. And I think EJI has done an absolutely incredible job of convincing a lot of Americans and across many different kinds of divisions, right? Rural, urban, Black, white, middle class, working class. They have helped convince many people that it's important to know this history, and they have provided places people can go and learn this history and materials they can access online and learn this history and processes that communities can go through to try to reckon with this history. I mean, it's incredible to me that a law firm has taken that on, and I'm really in awe of it.
Yeah. And I think you're, what you said about to know justice and that you have to have this history to give them true justice, I think is what you're doing with the story as well. So I saw some parallels in the book itself with walking through that museum. I went with Friendly City actually in December. So a group of us got to walk through and see the connections between the mid-Atlantic trade and slavery and Reconstruction and even now, present day. So I thought you made those connections as well. And so I just wanted to see if you had been there and if you had intentionally or unintentionally, had similar narratives. But yeah.
I just am so impressed with their work. I mean, as a professional historian, when I walk through their museum and their memorial and I read the signage, I can tell you which historians that work came from. You know what I mean? But no one needs to know that. They need to know the information, and it's not something that's accessible to most people if it stays in a kind of academic format.
Yeah.
And I think that it has been just such a great gift to Americans that they have taken on putting the history out there in ways that people can get it, all different kinds of folks can get it.
Yeah. And one more endorsement for this book, I thought also that I've read a lot of books of history, and some of them are really smart and dense. And I thought yours was really smart, but it wasn't as hard to read. It was very accessible, and it was very compelling. So Thank you so much for talking with me about it and for letting me ask you all these questions.
Oh, it's been a real pleasure, Hillary. Thank you.
Yeah. And so for people who are listening, until next time, happy reading.